Hi, and welcome to the Power of Connection Biz Show. I'm Kimberly Layne, executive leadership coach, best-selling author, and your host. Today, we have a unique guest, and she has a unique superpower. She's a mediator with over 20 years of theatrical experience, which it helps her to elevate her skills when helping divorcing couples come to amicable divorce agreements. She also uses these special skills to resolve conflict in the workspace, probate or estate tangles, and landlord and tenant gridlocks. You could kind of say she's a negotiation coach who loves to help people handle difficult conversations and come to an amicable resolution. On a personal note, she grew up in Southern Louisiana and has spent some time in the Czech Republic after college. She has two amazing and aspiring teenage boys, and her free time, she loves to hike and watch movies. Please welcome our wonderful guest, Alice Shakina. Alice, it's great to have you here today, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Kimberly. I'm very excited to be here and chat with you and your audience.
Wonderful. So I have to ask, just because I'm sure many of us, including many people in the audience, including myself, have been in situations where, whether it's with a partner, future partner, or an ex-partner, or even a employee or a peer, where you're trying to go through something very difficult, because usually there's a lot of emotion involved in that process, right? So how do you help couples or colleagues or peers, or clients maintain healthy respect and human connection during that process when you're trying to get through a very tense and terse conversation?
Well, one of the things that I talk about when I first start coaching them is really the role of the amygdala in all of these difficult conversations, right? The amygdala is a very small part of your brain that actually gets activated whenever someone is upset or angry. And what it does is shuts down your executive functioning part of your brain. So the part that you need the most when you're trying to have a very difficult conversation becomes further and further from your reach when you're upset. And so I think it's really important for people to understand that and the science behind that, so that they can figure out a way to keep that amygdala from hijacking their executive functioning. And
so do you have kind of like 3 steps or one even quick tidbit with regards to that the audience can take away? Anything you'd recommend?
Yes. First of all, you really should not have a conversation when you're in that state. So if you start to feel like you're upset or angry, do not power through, or do not let your anger guide you, because it will end badly and you will regret it. So what you want to do is take some measures to try to disengage and potentially come back to the conversation when you feel better. So it could be that if it's a minor upset, you can say, I need to get a drink of water. I'll be right back. And you can walk away. You want to take some deep breaths. So in through your nose, out through your mouth, several times until you feel your psychology, your physical being changing and feeling more grounded and calmer. If it's a large upset that you cannot calm down from in a matter of minutes, it might be better to say, Kimberly, this is not really a good time for me to talk about this right now because I'm really upset. Let me go away and calm down a little bit, and then let me come back to you and we can have this conversation again later this afternoon or tomorrow. Now, if you're in a committed relationship, people are always like, that doesn't work, because when I ask this time, they say, no, I want to resolve it, now. And so what I say to those people is, set up the parameters before there's conflict. So what I would say to you is to say, Kimberly, can we agree in the future, if you or I get upset and one of us asks for some time apart so that we can kind of calm down and come back, can we agree to allow the other person to get a timeout? If we agree to that prior to any sort of conflict, then when it happens, you can even come up with like a code phrase.
Right.
Someone said something the other day, they're like, bananas, right? Or like, hey, be the sunlight, right? That kind of thing. And so when you hear those phrases, it's like a note to yourself, oh, this is referring to that agreement that we held prior, where I'm going to give that person space to go calm down. So you have to do whatever you can to have these difficult conversations when your emotional state is at a low level.
So it's almost like what you're trying to do is take the emotion out of the conversation, because the emotional part is activating your amygdala, right? So
Yeah.
you want to get the emotion down and almost want to think a little bit more logical, more practical, more objective, if you will, and not all of those emotions flaring around that happen. Would you even say if there's a left or a right brain experience, left being more, is it left more logical and right more creative? Would you even go there, or not so much? It's really just the amygdala that's really affecting the whole situation.
It's the amygdala. And I feel like most people, and this included me in the past, where everyone has the mistaken belief that all they have to do is get through the conversation when they're angry, and then that whatever resolution comes about will actually resolve their own anger. And it actually does not work that way. Typically people will say, oh yeah, like we fought for 5 hours, or even I've heard recently from someone who was working with an employee and said, yeah, that went really badly. I was upset. I said some things I shouldn't have said. He said some things that we shouldn't have said. And then we like went apart and we didn't resolve it. It's usually, it doesn't get resolved. And if it does get resolved, it doesn't resolve in a really good way. It's more negative than positive. And so it's not about, let's power through this conversation. Right. I'm really angry. I need some resolution. It's more like, let's take a break. Let's calm down. Let's get all of our executive functioning together, operating, and let's actually even maybe think about some possible solutions and then come back to the table and have a calm conversation.
Yeah, it's more about coming to an amicable resolution than it is plowing through the journey at the immediate moment, with emotions high and anger and whatever else. So it's kind of keeping the best in mind, right?
Yes. Yes. And this works with everything. It works with your children, works with your significant others, works with employees, coworkers, clients, like any situation that you want to think about, it works with all of them.
Is there a healthy amount of time to create that space and an amount that would be considered too long? So for instance, sometimes in psychology, when you're looking at relationships, they say if you're having an argument with a significant other and something that you're trying to develop a relationship, or, you're trying to work it out and make it a long-term relationship. And they talk about if you have an argument, if you don't come back together and try to work through it, say in less than 24 hours, it really kind of dissipates the emotional investment that you're both trying to make. Does that make sense? So the studies show that if you're coming back to try to resolve the conflict sooner rather than later, and not, doing it within less than 24 hours, it's more likely to help the relationship move forward versus if you're waiting 24 to 48 hours or even longer, it kind of lets the relationship start to dissipate and kind of just not eventually mature into what it needs to be.
Yes, I usually, tell people like within a 24-hour time period, the person who is asking for the timeout has to come back and schedule something so that it happens within this 24-hour time period, right? Yeah. So even if it happens, like, let's say I have an argument and it's 9 o'clock at night, then it's incumbent upon me, if I'm asking for the timeout, to come back in the morning and say, okay, let's have a conversation this afternoon at 5 o'clock after work. I'll sit down. I'll make sure that I'm in the right frame of mind and right headspace to be able to have this conversation. So doing it, yes, within a 24-hour period is extremely reasonable in my opinion. And, if it's not that big of a conflict, you can probably figure it out in a few hours to say, exactly. I'll have a couple of hours.
Exactly. Yes. What about having people write things down? Does that helpful in advance of that 5 o'clock meeting after an argument the night before? Is there any value in each person kind of writing down their thoughts or journaling, if you will?
Absolutely, Kimberly. That's a great point. Yes, it's part of putting your thoughts together. It's also part of preparation, right? And I'm a huge believer of preparing for any negotiation or difficult conversation because when even a little bit of emotion starts to come in, if you're not prepared, if you don't know where your thoughts are, then that little bit of emotion can derail you. However, if you have your notes next to you, you've prepared your thoughts, you've prepared what sort of solution you'd like to offer, then even having a little bit of upsetness, you can use that as your guide to come back to pull the conversation back and say, you know what, let's like reframe here. Let's jump back to where we were and use your notes to continue and guide you through the conversation. Absolutely.
And I think it also, when you're journaling or writing things down, it helps to put the emotion out too, because you're not. I think sometimes you don't really know how you're upset, but you don't really know all the emotion behind it. Is it anger? Is it fear? Is it hurt? So by writing it down, I think it also helps you to kind of process that emotion behind it, so you're not going to be so emotional when you get to that topic. I find that's just beneficial on so many accounts. Great, good to
Yeah.
hear that part. Great. So let's kind of switch here a little bit. Some professions require what you talk about, client control. So, does that apply in any relationship, just really from a business perspective? But, using communication to help with that client control, and kind of explain to our audience, what do you mean by requiring client control?
So I work with some attorneys, and I am their client facing person, right? So I deal with clients, and there are difficult clients, people who start demanding things, who start asking for far more than they want, or maybe they don't want to listen to you and they want to do something else. Or, let's say that you are in the design field, and perhaps the clients are being very difficult in that way. So there different types of professions where you do have to use client control. And so sometimes the clients become very difficult and unmanageable. In some cases, it's better to just fire them. And I can talk about how to do that. But in other cases, it's just a matter of communicating and setting the expectations. So I find that a lot of people do not set the expectations up and set up. It's kind of like with children. Small children need boundaries. And you need to say, you can do this, but you can't do this. And so to be able to set up those same boundaries with clients, to let them know, this is not acceptable, this is not acceptable, and we only do it this way and this way. And if you don't want to do it this way, then perhaps we're not a good fit. So really be very firm with them. Someone asked me the other day, this client is starting to ask me to do all this stuff that's outside of the scope of the contracted work. She's doing it, and now she's starting to feel bitter.
Right.
Because she says, well, I'm doing all this extra work. It's not part of the contract. It's like scope creep. She keeps asking for a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. And now she says, well, now it's like worth billing them for, and I don't know how to have the conversation. So what I told her to do is, if you have a little bit of scope creep, just let them know, I'm happy to do this amount for you right now for free. But anything beyond this, if it's beyond the scope, I am going to charge you, and I'm going to end up charging you like everything that's beyond the scope of this contract. Right. And so I gave her that feedback. It was a client that was asking me about, like, how should I deal with this situation? Right. And so that's how I would deal with that. And for those people who feel like, oh my gosh, this client is horrible, I want to fire them, then it's really good to compile a list of things that are not compatible and explain to them. So this should be very businesslike and very calm, to say, here are the things that aren't working for me, and just write out a list to say, like, I asked for this and you didn't do this, and here are all the different times, and say, because of all of this, I don't think we're a good fit. So we probably need to like move on and not work with each other. So it's a very kind way to just let someone go.
Yeah. And it's also, because I've done some coaching on this as well, it's almost like you publish it, as opposed to, it's not really open for discussion. You're publishing how you feel about it and what you're trying to accomplish. It's almost like a factual data that they're not there to argue with, right? It's, right. It's kind of like, if you're breaking up with somebody, it's not really open for discussion at this point. You've had it, right? You're done for a variety of reasons, right? Yeah. And so you're really publishing it, as opposed to trying to have a conversation about whether you should break up with them or not, or whether you should fire the client or not. But I think presenting those facts in a logical form, I think most likely the client would probably agree to with whatever you stated too, and probably is relieved to get out of the relationship, right?
Yes. And then in addition to like the last example that I gave, where she's, I said, hey, after that, I'm going to charge you everything. I also add, and if that doesn't suit you, perhaps we shouldn't be working together. Maybe it's not a good fit if you'd like me to continue to do this work without you paying me, right? To let them know. So really, it's about setting expectations. I cannot stress how important it is. When people do not set expectations, conflict ensues every single time. But if you set your boundaries very clearly and you set the expectations very clearly, then hiring them, firing them, getting them in line, all of that becomes like really, really easy.
Yeah, I think if there's one takeaway, and I will totally agree with that, and that is so appropriate in any relationship, in any conversation, is setting the expectation of what you want to accomplish, what we're going to get out of it. What's the roles and responsibilities, how long it's going to go on, what's the scope, et cetera. But expectations, I think, are just a great way to start. And it's really a great recipe for success, right? It makes things easier down the road just if you've got to let someone go or fire or, whatever it is. But great suggestion. Wonderful. I am curious, in taking a step back too, is, you've had over 20 years of theatrical experience. And I'm kind of curious, and I'm sure the audience is as well. How has that parlayed into what you're doing from a mediation, coaching perspective and negotiation? I'm sure there's some great skills in there that have elevated your ability to work with a variety of people. Is anything you want to share on that aspect?
Sure. It's funny because I've spoken to a lot of therapists, and it's very interesting how the study of psychology and studying acting overlap significantly. So when you're studying to be an actual actor, you're not necessarily, learning how to memorize your lines or learning how to portray a character. The first couple of years when you go into acting studies is you're trying to figure out like the human psychology, foremost your own, right? So you want to take away all the baggage that you have, and you want to just really unpeel those layers of the onion so that you can get rid of all of the things that are blocking your emotional life. And then you want to be able to access all of your emotions. You also have to learn what your triggers are. What's triggering you to get upset? How can you resolve that? And then you start doing partner work. That's sort of the second step. And you start to learn, what are your partner's triggers? What can I do to make Kimberly angry? What can I do to make her calm? What can I do to make her laugh? What can I do to make her cry? And so you learn a lot about human beings doing this type of work. And so because of that, when I mediate, I am able to read what in theater we call the subtext. So one of the things that you learn in theaters when you're reading a script, you always want to figure out what is the subtext, what is not being said, what are the objectives of the characters, what do they really want that they're not saying that they want, and it's making them say these other lines, but the motivation is over here somewhere else, right? So when I'm mediating, I am constantly listening between the lines. I'm trying to figure out what is not being said that's really important, and what are their motivations. Because if I can figure out what their motivations are, and I can figure out what's not being said, I can guide them to a successful settlement agreement, right? So I do that. And then I also was a director. And so as a director, you have to be able to articulate to a whole cast of actors how you want them to act without a line reading. And for those of you who are not familiar with theater, a line reading is basically saying the line exactly how you want it to be said. Mm-hmm. So it would be me as a director saying, well, I want you to say the words, get out of here, like this, get out of here. And I expect the person to copy the exact phrasing, the exact intonation. And that's absolutely ridiculous. To expect someone to copy the exact way I say it, you want it to come from the heart. Right. So I have to be able to articulate to them ways of being so that they get it intuitively, and it comes from their heart. And on top of that, I also have to communicate with all of the designers so that my vision shows up on the stage. So there's set designers, sound designers, lighting designers, right? And all of these people. So that piece of communication is also translated when I'm mediating, because I'm able to communicate articulately so that both parties can understand one another. A lot of what I do is rephrase what you, Kimberly, have just said to the other person if they're not really understanding you. So I have to be able to understand both parties extraordinarily well, because at any given moment, I have to be able to rephrase what you said so that the other side actually understands what you're trying to say.
I know that makes you very exceptional. I can totally relate. I took acting lessons when I was younger, and I had just a huge appreciation because in order for you to become somebody different than you are. So for example, I'm, conservative, honor student, pretty, good girl, etc. And I had to play this promiscuous smoker of a woman who was just, all over the place. And you have to be very comfortable with who you are originally in order to become somebody else. And so it just was a huge, huge eye opener from an acting skill set to really, the whole psychology around it and becoming somebody else. But that whole subtext you talked about and understanding the objective or the underlying emotion was so key. And I just find that extremely fascinating. And I know for sure it really helps you excel at what you do from a negotiation coach perspective and working with your clients.
Yes, definitely does.
We are running close to the end of our time together. So I don't want to leave without giving you two opportunities. One, is there something else you want to discuss and share with our audience outside of your course coming up, but just a message, a last thought, a last tidbit, or we can just talk about your course coming up and I will share the link and the subtitles. I'll let you choose.
I'd love to give them a little tip. It's something that seems really common sense and people know about and very few people actually do. So I want to give them a reminder to practice active listening. And so active listening means you put away your devices, you put away your computer, and you look at the person eyeball to eyeball when they're talking to you, and you listen with 100% of your attention. And that doesn't necessarily mean just shaking your head, nodding your head, saying, okay, okay, but it means that you're actually listening so deeply and so intently that at any given time, if someone says, what was just being said, you can articulate everything that you just heard. And people rarely do this.
Yep.
You want to try to do this in your daily relationships with your family members, your significant other, maybe your coworkers, and just try to listen to someone talk for a minute or 2 minutes. It feels really long for people who don't do it because normally people are speaking like rapid fire back and forth, or maybe they're asking questions to clarify. Just listen. And you might even try to practice this with someone that you talk to on a regular basis to say, let's spend 5 minutes a day doing active listening. And what you would do is spend 2 minutes speaking. The other person listens for 2 minutes and spend, I'll say 6 minutes total, 2 minutes. And then the other person speaks for 2 minutes without any interruption. And the last 2 minutes are split up a minute and a minute where you're rephrasing and reframing what you heard, so that the other person can tell you, Kimberly, you did a great job. You actually did listen. That's what I said. Or Kimberly, you missed a bunch of details that I talked about and you forgot to mention it in your, recap to me, right? And so practice that. It's 6 minutes a day, very little, but it will take you like very far.
Yes. And it's a great way to build trust with whoever you're listening to. I often use a quote and I used it in the book that I just published, but it was chapter on listening that I have, and it said, most people listen with the intent to interrupt, right? They're just trying to think about what they can say to interrupt the conversation or to give, whatever their personal story is, right? So active listening, I think, is very key for developing really good connection in your relationships and building trust. So yes. Let's talk about your negotiation course coming up, and just give us a little quick highlight, and I will include the link to Alice's negotiation course in the subtitle. So Alice, please share. I'm really excited to hear about this as well.
Yeah, so I have a negotiation course. I'm so excited to let everybody know about it because it will change your life. I've had multiple people come through and every single person has said, this has changed my life. And why? Your listeners might wonder, what are you doing that makes it change my life? It really empowers you, even if whether you're the person who's like, I don't like negotiating, or I don't use negotiating, or I don't do this in my life. Everyone negotiates. You negotiate who's going to do the dishes, yep. Right? Whose turn is it? Or what restaurant shall we go out to eat at and whatnot. So there are negotiations happening in everyone's lives. However, for those of the listeners who are beginning and they're like, it makes me nervous, I don't really want to do it, and I don't do it regularly, it will empower you tremendously. You will suddenly realize an entire world has just opened up, and all of these opportunities where you never saw them before now exist. You actually can see them now. And then you'll think to yourself, I'm getting so much more out of my life than I used to get. And for those people who are more advanced, the course is really great for them because it's a practicum. So you practice negotiating. So even if you're at the top of your game, you get to practice all kinds. And I tailor the course. It's a small group negotiation course. So I tailor it based on your needs. So if you come to me, Kimberly, and say, hey, this is the problem that I have today, or I'm going to negotiate next week, we practice it. We role play, right? So that you're ready to go.
I love it. I think it's going to be a great course. I really encourage our listeners to sign up. Again, I will have the link in the subtitles of the video. I really would like to say thank you so much, Alice, for being here today. It was really an interesting conversation and a unique one, but I think something that all of our listeners really enjoyed, including myself. So for right now, I want to say thank you all for listening. If you like the content, please subscribe to our channel, The Power of Connection in Biz. Otherwise, bye for now, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Alice.
Thanks, Kimberly. Bye.